Okay, we're doing a series on Shabbat, and I'm covering some of the basic commands of Shabbat. The next one that we need to work on is kindle no fire. This is Exodus 35:3. You shall kindle no fire throughout your habitations upon the Shabbat day. So again, very specific command of what is included in this term no work. There is an interesting example of this. This is found in Numbers 15:32 through 36. And while the sons of Israel were in the wilderness, they found a man that gathered sticks upon the Shabbat day. And they that found him gathering sticks brought him unto Moshe and Aaron and upon all the congregation. You'll notice there that the congregation is doing the judgment, not the leaders. And they put him inward, because it was not declared what should be done to him. In other words, they put him in some kind of a jail. And Yahuwah said unto Moshe, the man shall be surely put to death. All the congregation shall stone him with stones outside the camp. And all the congregation brought him outside the camp and stoned him with stones, and he died as Yahuwah commanded Moshe. Now, as we study the precedence issue, we see that murder and idolatry, which are the top two commandments, are the most important ones, and they are the ones who take precedence over killing. Okay, so capital punishment is required in those two cases. Now, sinning of any kind carries with it the death penalty. But because Yeshua has died for those sins on the cross, we do not have to die for those sins. What this means is that on lesser sins, if it's not idolatry and it's not a murder issue, then the punishment, which is death, can be commuted to a fine and a sacrifice. Now, what this means is that if you violate Shabbat, normally they're not going to stone you, okay? So the question is, why are they stoning this guy? He should be fined and have a sacrifice put on him. It should be commuted. And so what we're seeing here is that what is actually happening is that this person is not repentant. If he is not repentant of his sin, then he must die for his sin. Why? Because now he is rejecting the Torah. And by rejecting the Torah, he is committing idolatry. And idolatry carries with it the death penalty in the land of Israel. Okay, so Shabbat requires that we kindle no fire. And of course, he was gathering up sticks in order to make a fire, obviously. There is some discussion concerning kindling a fire that we need to talk about. According to the Torah8s, it means that you're not supposed to have a fire going at all on Shabbat, and so they don't have hot food on Shabbat. They would have to have cold food on Shabbat. It also means that they don't do the candle lighting ceremony. According to rabbinics, they light a candle as a part of a ceremony, telling us that, okay, now we're in Shabbat, we're not going to be doing any work. They make it very, they do this ceremony at the beginning of Shabbat, and then they do another ceremony called Havdalah at the end of Shabbat, in order to make it very clear to everyone that we have now started our time of resting and we're no longer doing any work. And at the end, we are now starting our week so that we can do work after this, which is not a bad tradition, in order to make that the differentiation between the regular week and the Shabbat very clear to everyone. But what they do, once they light the candle, then the candle will remain burning the rest of the evening. In other words, it will be burning on Shabbat, which the Torah8s would say, no, you can't do that. But you will notice that the command says not to burn a fire, but to kindle a fire, meaning that you're not allowed to start a fire on Shabbat. And so this is important, and of course it makes sense, because if you had a wildfire, for example, that was continuing to burn on Shabbat, then everyone would be sinning because there's a fire burning on Shabbat. So that doesn't even make any sense, right? So, so it basically says you shall not start a fire on Shabbat. And this is different than the command for cooking. It says to not cook. It doesn't say do not start cooking. So when we talk about cooking, we have to do the cooking prior to Shabbat. And then there's a differentiation between cooking and serving. Serving would include reheating. It would include, stirring the stuff, picking it up, getting it on the plate, cleaning it up afterwards. All of that stuff can be done because it's not actually part of the cooking process. So those are distinctions that we have to make in these commands in order to understand what we're going to do. Now, later on in this series, I'm going to talk about the ramifications of these commands, because you have to put them all together to figure out how to cook your Saturday meal. But let's continue on. Here's another command about Shabbat. This is Exodus 34:21. And it reads, 6 days you shall work, but on the 7th day you shall rest. You can see that this command about Shabbat is a big deal in the Torah. It's mentioned many times. But it continues here after it says you're supposed to rest on Shabbat. It says in earing time, which is the time when you're working in the fields, and in harvest you shall rest. In other words, when you have a lot of work to do because of the season that you're in, or whatever job you have, if you have to do overtime, for example, what this is saying is that you are specifically forbidden to work on Shabbat, even though you have all this extra work to do, even though it's a big problem. Now, of course, you're going to get into the precedence issue here, because if you're going to lose your job for not working on Shabbat, and your family is going to starve, that takes precedence over Shabbat. Okay? And in a Gentile land, we have that concern. In the land of Israel, following the Torah, of course, we do not have that concern. We just have to look at, well, we've got planting, we've got harvesting, we've got these things going on. We're going to lose crops if we're going to rest on Shabbat. But what this is saying is that we need to depend upon God for our prosperity. If we are not depending upon God, if we are trying to make our prosperity ourselves by working on Shabbat, and we're telling God that we are not trusting Him for our prosperity, then guess what? It's not going to prosper us. Okay? But where does your prosperity come from? Does it come from the work that you do, or does it come from God? You can work, and of course this is mentioned in the Proverbs. You do a whole lot of work, you're a workaholic, you're not going to get prospered because you're depending upon yourself for your prosperity rather than God. Now, that doesn't mean that we're not supposed to work hard. We're supposed to work hard. We're supposed to work, it says right in the command, we're supposed to work 6 days. Okay, and in the ancient world, they worked all day long from sun up to sundown for 6 days. It was unheard of to have a day off. It was only in Israel that they didn't work 7 days. Okay, because it just had to work real hard in those days because they didn't have a lot of technology to help them out. But so we're supposed to be working hard, but we're supposed to be giving a day to God. And we have to depend upon Him for our prosperity. And we do that, we acknowledge Him being the master in charge of taking care of us by giving Him that day. Okay, now I mentioned this already, precedence. Life takes precedence over Shabbat. If you are starving, if you're sick, if you're a small child, if you are an elderly person, these people have special issues. If your animal is in a ditch, is one example that's given in Scripture. You have to preserve life, and that takes precedence over Shabbat. Okay, so that's different than the command about not harvesting. Okay, if you're not harvesting, what does that mean? That means that you may not make quite as much money. So money does not take precedence over Shabbat, but life does. If you've got a situation where you have to take care of something, you have to pick grain in the field because you're starving, these kind of situations are mentioned in Scripture, and precedence allows you to do that. The problem with precedence, however, is that if you think about it, you can use precedence to do all kinds of work on Shabbat. Military, for example, is an area where you are defending life. So you have to have some people on duty on Shabbat. Okay? But there's a lot of things that you can do that you can say, well, this is preserving life. My boss won't let me off, so I'm going to do this because that's preserving life because I'd starve otherwise. Well, would you really starve is the question. Okay, is there no other job for you? Okay, that is the question that you have to think about. And so what we need to do is, instead of turning our brain power to how can I get out of Shabbat in every way possible, but rather using our brain power to figure out solutions to not work on Shabbat. If I have to feed my animals, is there some sort of an automatic feeder where I can do that ahead of time, a day ahead of time? Okay, there's all kinds of solutions that you can come up with to get out of work on Shabbat, and that's where we need to put our brain power. All right, so this covers the basic commands of Shabbat. The next time we talk about Shabbat, we're going to get into a little bit more specific applications of these commands.